I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker. Just before we get started, I just want to say that I'm excited to hear about this, and I hope you all are too. As you can see by the title, it's called the title of the talk is called An American in Gascony. I hope I didn't mispronounce that too badly. And I want to just give you a little background on Professor Langer. He retired from the Department of French and Italian at UW-Madison in 2020, just before the pandemic forced us all to go online. His specialty is French literature and intellectual history of the 16th century. He joined the UW-Madison faculty in 1985. Ulrich has taught at various other institutions, including Bryn Mawr College, the University of Chicago, the University of Tübingen in Germany, and the universities of Nantes and Tours in France. He first bought a house in Southwest France in 1996, spending 3 to 4 months there most years. His wife, Anne, and he live in Madison the remainder of the year. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Langer. Okay, Ulrich.
Okay. Yes, everybody can hear me, I hope. Thank you to Sandy, thank you to Esther, and thank you to the Wisconsin Retirement Association Travel Committee, on which I am, which gives me this opportunity of talking about living in part of the year, at least in southwestern France. So I have a slideshow, so I'm going to show you various images of the region and the town and a little bit of my house. And then talk a little bit about what owning a house in France entails. I hope that there will be a lot of questions because I'm leaving a lot of time for the question period. So first of all, where am I and where is Gascony? I'm going to see if I can. There we go. So the house I bought, it's actually the second house, is in what is now called the Occitanie, and in English it would be Occitania, and it comes from the transcription of Occitan, which is one of the current Southern dialects and was one of the languages, medieval languages that became French. And Occitania is a region that is in the southwest, as you can see. It's in red here, and it's in between the Atlantic regions and then the Provence region of southern France. And the regions in France are divided into departments, or what are called départements. And the department in which I am is the Gers or the Gers. You can pronounce the S or not, depending on on where you come from. And the departments in France are generally called by the rivers that flow through them, and that's the case in my department. This is the sort of the heart of Gascony. The capital of Gascony is Auch, and Auch right here in the middle, and it's very hard to pronounce. Nobody really knows how to pronounce it who doesn't know French. And in fact, in Auch, the cathedral has a statue of D'Artagnan, who was one of the musketeers, and the Gascon musketeers is sort of a semi-true historical tradition that dates from actually quite a long time ago, and therefore Gascony. Gascony also, the term Gascony comes from Gascon, which is a version of the Latin Vasco or Vascones in the plural. And it's actually the origin both of Gascon and of Basque. So the Basque region in Spain and in French has the same etymological origin as Gascony, but Gascony refers to the southwestern region in France. So where I am is, so the capital is Auch. You can see a little there's a little airport that it's basically a private airport. And then I'm very close to a city in which no one wants to live because of the name, what it means in English, which is Condom. And I'm in the town of Lectoure, which is here just to the east of Condom. And Lectoure comes from the Latin lactora, and the Lactorates, which was the tribe living around Lectoure. It's a prehistoric site you have sarcophagi and tombs from prehistory and all sorts of things that you find when you dig up the ground around the town. Lectoure is on a promontory, as you can see right here. On all of these sides, there are valleys, and it sits on sort of on a rocky promontory, and it's dominated on one side by the cathedral, which you can see here, and then the main street runs through to what is an 18th century building, and then beyond the 18th century building, I'll show you another view of it, the Chateau of the Counts of Armagnac. The town of Lectoure is dominated by a cathedral that was a bishop's seat until the early 19th century. And the main medieval remnant is this large tower, which dates mostly from the 15th century, and the rest of the building, the nave, is mostly a hybrid construction because it was destroyed at various phases of the often very violent French history. On the other end of the town, you have the Chateau of the Counts of Armagnac, which was used mainly during the wars of the 100 Years' War between the French crown and the English. The Armagnac were allies of the French crown, and they used Lectoure as one of their principal fortified staging grounds. And so this portion of the ramparts is the old castle of the Counts of Armagnac. Then there were additions made. You can see this is a slightly more modern construction that was renovated recently. And the whole town, all of its sides, except for behind the cathedral, are surrounded by or are fortified with ramparts. And so you can go around the town and view the ramparts. The town of Lectoure is situated on a pilgrimage route there are various pilgrimage routes through France through the Pyrenees and then the Basque region of Spain to Santiago de Compostela. And Lectoure is one of the main stages in this pilgrimage route. So you will find pretty much all during the year pilgrims like this one coming towards Lectoure and actually staying in Lectoure. There are hostels for pilgrims in the town itself. And this one is right next to cathedral and used to be the presbytery of the cathedral, but is now used as a hostel for pilgrims. The town itself is situated not that far from the Pyrenees. If you look on a clear day towards the south from Lectoure, you can see the range of the Pyrenees. And in fact, we're pretty much in the center of the range of the Pyrenees. If you go directly south from Lectoure, after about 60 miles, you're right in the heart of the Pyrenees. You can only see the Pyrenees, like I said, if it's a very clear day. During the summer, it's hazy, and if you can see the Pyrenees during the summer, it means that it's going to rain, and that's usually the case during the summer. In the winter, in January, when I actually like to be there a lot, the mountains are quite visible on most days. So it's a very pretty place to just by seeing the mountains on the horizon. The Pyrenees are close enough so that you can go down and hike, and there's a tremendous hiking system in the Pyrenees that's more or less governed by the French state. There's a national system of hiking trails, and the Pyrenees obviously are featured in that. They're extremely well maintained, extremely well marked, so you can walk in the Pyrenees. So hiking is an option, and then biking is an option as well. Here my wife and I are on top of the Pont de Balès, which is in the more on the Mediterranean side of the Pyrenees, and there are various roads that you can bike on that are used by the Tour de France. And recently, in the last 15 years or so, the French government has installed these little signs that for cyclists, as you can see, a cyclist struggling to get up the hill, and showing the average gradient, and then how many kilometers you've covered, and the amount of altitude change that you've done. So biking is a great option for those who are very fit in the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees, the roads are not just for human beings. As you go above a certain altitude, it becomes what the French call a pastoral zone, which means that cattle and sheep are allowed to range freely on the roads and on the fields. So this is coming around a turn on a descent, and I was going pretty fast, and I had to brake very hard to avoid hitting all of these weirdly colored sheep that were being moved from one pasture to the other. And the sheep are all colored. They have the colors of their owners on them. So it's sort of a surreal scene when you get into some of these herds, because they're strangely colored, and they contrast obviously with all of the natural landscape around them. To get back to Lectoure itself, just in terms of the town itself, it's not one of the big tourist towns. The tourist towns that are frequented by Americans are mainly in the Provence towards the east in the Rhone Valley. And this is a little bit off the beaten track, so it resembles more a sort of a normal French town, even though there are quite a few tourists during the summer. There's a weekly market that goes all year round in the winter as well as in the summer. And here you have the cathedral that you saw at the beginning and the main street leading through the town. And the market has everything from fruit and vegetables all year round, chicken and especially duck, fish, bread, cheese, armagnac, which I will say what it is in just a moment, olives and nuts, sausage, hams, and sometimes, especially during the summer months, clothes. So it's sort of a flea market a little bit, with some clothes and even mattresses and things like that. So it's something where it's sort of a weekly event for the town. That's a lot of fun. In the town itself, the town was destroyed or damaged severely during the 100 Years' War, and especially during the religious wars in the 16th century. So some of the old medieval buildings are no longer there because they were destroyed during sieges in the religious wars in the 16th century. Some of the oldest buildings are 15th century. There's a facade of the Sénéchaussée, and you can see the flamboyant Gothic entrance. The Sénéchaussée is the house of the Sénéchal, and the Sénéchal was sort of the royal administrator of that part of the province in Lectoure. Some of the other buildings are 17th and 18th century. After the religious wars, Lectoure was heavily some people say occupied, or at least invested in by the Catholic Church, because Lectoure was a Protestant town. And so a lot of convents were built and situated in Lectoure to make sure that the Catholic faith would be well maintained after religious wars. And here's a Carmelite convent the building dates, the original building from the 17th century, and there were some 18th century additions. And it's still functioning today. There are Carmelites living in the convent. It has a wonderful chapel ceiling, a painted chapel ceiling that that reminds you of the fact that that churches and cathedrals, all sizes of churches in the Middle Ages and throughout the old regime in France were painted, and it's only in the 19th century that the paint was removed to give them sort of a white grayish interior. Another building in Lectoure is from the 18th century, and this is the thermal baths of Lectoure, and it has has actually on the inside functioning spas. You can have a spa, you can have bath massages, physical therapy, all sorts of things, and people come and spend days here getting their what the French call cure, C-U-R-E, and health insurance often pays for this. So there's a little bit of business that is connected with the spa. Another 18th century building is what was converted to a hospital during Napoleonic times, and it's sort of an 18th century hotel particulier at the end of the town, and it's now been converted to a whole collection of antiques dealers. So you go through the arcades, and there's one antique dealer after another with everything from, as you can see, from deer heads to porcelain and silverware and engravings and all sorts of things. And this is what this is actually one of the main economic activities of the town now is antiques, and a lot of antique stores either in this 18th century hospital or former hospital and on Main Street. In Gascony, there are other reasons than architecture to be there, and one of them is what you can eat and drink. And the special duck is a southwestern favorite, and it comes in various forms. One form is the confit de canard, which is duck that's been macerated in fact, it's kept in jars in its fat, and then it's taken out of the fat and then sauteed and served with various accompaniments. Orange is one of the possibilities, but that's not the only one. Another form of serving duck is duck breast, magret de canard, and magret is actually means maigre, that is the thin or lean part of the duck, even though on the outside obviously you have quite a bit of fat, but this part is quite lean. Another form of duck is something that Americans either love or hate and have outlawed, and that's foie gras, which you also get in everywhere really in Gascony, and you can buy anywhere in Lectoure, and that has not been outlawed by the government. Another specialty is melons, and it's melons are like cantaloupes. It's called melon, and a melon it's a small cantaloupe that has these stripes, and it's slightly more flavorful than the American cantaloupe I found. And it's served either alone or with ham, with smoked ham, usually with smoked ham, and sometimes with pork. Another is wine. There's quite a bit of wine. I can talk a lot about what sorts of wines there are around the area, and then distilled spirits, and especially Armagnac, which is like cognac. And a lot of the grapes that you see planted around Lectoure and around Gascony are used to produce Armagnac. And we have actually around Lectoure, there is a vineyard that's only 200 meters from the town, and it's called the Domaine d'Arton right here, which produces white, red, and rosé. And here you can see a view of the vineyards. And I bike along a road that goes right along the vineyard. I've never been inside to the domain itself, but you can visit it and taste the wine. I've had the wine, but I haven't been to the property itself. Another Gascon specialty is Floc de Gascogne, and literally floc means in Gascon means fleur, which is flower. So it's a flower of Gascony, and it's a fortified wine similar to the closest in that people here would know of is port wine. And in France, Pinot de Charente is another another variation of it. And it uses some Armagnac and wine and some sugar, and it becomes sort of an aperitif in white or in red. And I actually belong to I officially own a tiny bit of a vineyard that produces Floc de Gascogne. It's the best thing that they do. Their wine is not so good, but the Floc is really quite good. And I just bottled some last September with some friends. So if you come and visit me in Lectoure, I can have you taste some of our own Floc de Gascogne. So here I'm trying to make sort of zero in on my house. Here I'm trying to take a selfie. I'm very bad at selfies. And I was trying to get the main street that leads down the promontory towards the 18th century hospital or former hospital with the antiques dealers. And you will see just behind my head, there's a spire of a church, and my house is right in the street right there. So this is on top of the cathedral tower, which I visited this summer, and here's a much better view without me in it. And you can see the church spire, and then this is where the antiques dealers are, and that's the main street going down. And the Pyrenees would be on this side here. This is a view towards the west. Our house is what is called a maison de ville, as opposed to a maison de campagne. Maison de ville is literally a townhouse, house within a town, and as opposed to a house in the countryside, which means that the townhouse generally might have a courtyard, but would not have a garden and would not be surrounded by any terrain. I share my windows. I share my walls on either side with my neighbors, and you can see that the house used to be an upholsterer's shop, and you can still see the name of the upholsterer shop, Louis Lévy, tapissier décorateur, so decorator, and tapissier is an upholsterer. And in fact, when I bought it, there still were some upholsterer's tools in the cellar, which is down here. There's a little opening towards the cellar. Lectoure was an historically protected town, and a lot of these old towns are, so that you cannot change anything in the facade. Once, when you buy it, you can't just completely redo the facade. The facade has to maintain its identity. And so I kept obviously the outside with the inscription, and I'm obliged to do this by law because it's a historically protected zone. So this is another view of it. This is going down towards the ramparts. The ramparts are down here, and these would be the Pyrenees up here if it were a very clear day. And so the town, except for the main street, is all on very steep roads leading down to the ramparts or up to the main street from the ramparts. A few years ago, I decided to do some major work on the house, and this is what it looked like. This is the cellar, and this was the first floor, and this is the stairs leading up to 2.5 more floors above, and the whole place was gutted. And I had a reinforced parquet floor put in, and then they had to put in reinforcements for the floors above because they were all in very, very bad shape. And then the first floor was covered with sort of a limestone covering on the stone because, as you could see in one of the previous slides, Lectoure is a thermal or a bath, has baths, which means that the water comes from the underground, and the whole town is situated on this rock that sort of has a capillary system to it, and water's constantly sort of filtering up. So the houses tend to be fairly humid, and I needed to have walls that allow some humidity to evaporate into the open. Another thing I had to have done is the roof. And you can see this is the new roof that was installed. This is looking towards the Pyrenees, which you can't see because of a low cloud covering. And the roofs of Lectoure are all, again, historically protected, and you'll find that in a lot of French towns that pretty much any visible aspect of the architecture will be protected by some sort of regulation. The roofs have to be built covered in this old tile construction. There's a wood structure underneath, and then wood slats that hold these terracotta tiles, and the tiles themselves are fairly heavy, but they can blow away in storms, and they're sort of not that easy to maintain, and so you need to have people who once in a while will check out the roof and remove moss and things like that, and fix leaks. So it's not like your asbestos tile roof in the States, which is perfectly fine, but then you have to replace every 10 years. Once this is done, I don't think I will ever have to bother with my roof again. The roof that I had on there was probably on there for 40 or 50 years before I got the house. So I just want to spend just a couple of minutes, and then I will stop on some of the things some of the sort of formal things involved with buying and owning a house in France. And this is obviously from an American point of view. I don't have any kind of European citizenship. I just have my American passport. I have an American residence. So first of all, anyone can purchase property in France. There's no restriction on being French or not being French. Usually, unless you have a lot of cash, you get a mortgage, and French banks have international divisions, so you can get the mortgage through a French bank, and you are pretty much obliged to do so because United States banks tend to not want to give mortgages for foreign property. In fact, a lot of English and Dutch buy property in France, and so the French banks are quite used to dealing with non-French natives taking out mortgages. One of my first encounters with this was when we first bought our house. I was in our bank, and I witnessed a conversation between a Dutchman and a bank employee, a French bank employee, and they were speaking English to negotiate a loan for the Dutch person building a house in France. So these things are quite, even in very rural regions, these things are quite common. If anyone wants to buy a house in my audience, I would suggest not working directly with the owners, but working through an agency or a local notary, because all sorts of things can go wrong. If you don't plan to live there permanently, you will have taxes to pay, but there are two kinds of real estate taxes in France. And I found that over the years it's a lot less, even though I have more square footage in France than I do in Madison. It's a lot less than Madison city taxes, which are the highest that I've encountered. In terms of revenue taxation, as long as you maintain a principal residence in the US, you only pay United States taxes. You never pay French income taxes because of the double taxation agreement between the States and France. So if you were a permanent resident of France, even if you're an American, you would have to pay French taxes and not United States taxes. But in a way, you do pay a lot of taxes just being there, living there, because the VAT, the value-added tax in France, is much higher for consumer products and services. So even if you like hire somebody to do work on your house, you're paying a value-added tax on the service that is quite a bit higher than what you would pay in the States. So there are other forms of taxation that France has, as opposed to real estate that are higher than what you would pay in the States. In terms of health insurance, I've been able to live there for part of the year, for most years except for the COVID years, just using my own health insurance in the States that covers any kind of emergency in France. And they won't cover routine care, but they do cover emergencies. In fact, US health insurance is very happy to buy, to reimburse you for services that you get in France, because French healthcare is so much less expensive than US healthcare. And if you get any kind of emergency procedure done, even hospital stay in France, it will be a lot less than the US equivalent. So they're very happy to reimburse you for something that they would have to pay a lot more for if it were here. If you plan to rent out your property, you can do so. There are various, there's even an academic website called Sabbaticals, where you can have academics stay in your house for a sabbatical or something like that. I've never done that, mainly because I like to be able to go there in various times of the year and not have renters there while I'm there. And then, so I've never actually done that, but I've done it on the other side, in the sense that I've spent a sabbatical in France when I had to be in Paris and rented from an American. It helps to speak French. It helps a lot, but it's not absolutely necessary. There are a lot of British people and there are a lot of Dutch people who speak very rudimentary French or no French at all, and they get along perfectly well. A common perception is that the French are not very friendly, and I think that is pretty much true for people living in Paris, but it's not true for people living in the provinces. And I think I would compare it to New York. My own sense is that with, obviously you can't generalize completely, but people in large cities and New Yorkers tend to be a little bit more abrupt than people in the Midwest. And it's the same thing in Paris and France. In Paris, people are a little bit more less open to foreigners than people in the provinces. It's very easy, even if you only live part-time in a town or a small city, to get involved in what the French call association, and that is we would call them clubs, and they have clubs for everything. They have association for walkers, hikers, cyclists, tennis people, groups that are devoted to discussing philosophy, arts, theater. There's what is called a café philo. It's a cafe of philosophy where the people meet regularly in a cafe and have philosophical discussions. You can do volunteer work, all sorts of things. And these associations are actually subsidized by the French government. So you can get a small subsidy to be able to rent a space if you have meetings and things like that. And I know this from the cycling club that I'm in. They get an annual subsidy from the city, which then comes from the government. And that's to encourage these sorts of civic activities and sociability in the provinces. And obviously, if you're religious, there's especially Catholic services regularly, even though we have Protestant temples, and we also have an Orthodox church, a Greek Orthodox church, just outside of Lectoure, which is pretty rare, but it's there. But in fact, the French are much more secular than Americans, and don't really go to church that regularly. So it's a way to meet people, but it's not something that that you have to do, or that there's any kind of obligation connected to it. And then also to meet people, it helps to patronize the smaller local stores and cafes rather than the large supermarkets. And if you go to the same one repeatedly, you will get recognized, and people will say hello to you and start talking to you. So it's that's another thing that you can do if you want to meet people in town. Now the disadvantages are several, and I've gotten to know them intimately. Renovation work is costly, and that is. So let's see if I can do this. You can, if you hire someone, you pay taxes and indirectly insurance of the workmen. A lot of French people, especially in rural areas, hire people on the black market. And you can do that, and I've done that sort of unknowingly a couple of times because friends have recommended somebody who came and did small jobs, but in fact I had to pay them cash because they were working on the black market, and it's perfectly possible to do that, but it's not really to your advantage as a foreigner, because you can get into real trouble with insurance. You can get in trouble with even obviously with the law as well. And so I've tried to stay away from that. That means that things are more expensive, but at least it's above the board. For any kind of work, and that applies not just to Lectoure and to historically preserved areas, you need to get permission from your city office, the Office d'Urbanisme, of urbanism, as the French say. And they have to give you a work permit, and then if you are in a historically protected area, you have to get another permit from the National Agency for Historic Preservation, which is called the Bâtiment de France, and they are very, very picky. It's sometimes very difficult to work with them. Timelines are very approximate. The workmen will always tell you, oh yes, we can get this done, yeah, maybe in the spring. And then when spring rolls around, they say, oh, maybe not, maybe in the fall. And then and especially the smaller jobs just take a lot of time to get done, because they keep getting more work, and they tend to do larger jobs first, and they keep putting off the things that aren't that large. And also, if they know that you're not going to be there, they say, oh, well, he's not going to care. And so it's not. So timelines are very, you have to have a lot of patience, and it's often pretty frustrating. Transportation is wonderful in the cities. There are trains and buses or even subway pretty much everywhere in the cities. But in rural areas, you will need a car. And that's, I've always had some sort of car arrangement when I was there. And driving is more expensive than the States. Gas or diesel is much more expensive, 3 times as expensive, sometimes 4 times as expensive than the States. And the freeways, the autoroute are all tollways, so that is expensive too. And the best option really other than keeping a car there, which you could, but it has its own complications, is longer term purchase and resale of new cars, which I've been doing. And I can tell you about if you're interested. Now, it so happens that somebody I can't see who's in my audience because it's a webinar, but there's someone, a good friend named Chris Kleinhans, who should be in the audience. And he has a friend who is selling a house right now in an area that's north of Gascony, in a town called Saint-Cyprien. And if you're interested in buying much nicer than mine, you should get in touch with him, and I'm very willing to his address, and then he can put you in touch with him. So I will stop now. I've gone on for almost 45 minutes, so I would like to answer questions if you have questions, and you can always contact me. I'm on through the UW. I have an email address through WhiskEdu, so you can find me there. So I will let Esther maybe take over and see if there are questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ulrich. Let me see if there are any questions. I don't have any at this point yet, unless they're somewhere besides in the questionnaires. Let me check and see. I don't see anything. Are there no questions? Wow, you really wowed them.
So I'll start it as someone is probably typing. What was behind your decision to purchase a home and share your time between here and France?
Thanks for that. It's actually through the Witness Protection Program. No, I'm just kidding. It was because my work takes me and still takes me and took me even from the very beginning very regularly to France, and I would go there for conferences. I would go there for research work in libraries. So it sort of, I was always spending a lot of time in France. And at some point we decided that we might look at a place, just an apartment in Paris. A lot of Americans buy apartments in Paris. And then we were thinking, well, I mean, the time we would spend in France, it would be in the summer. And in the summer, you don't really want to be in Paris. It's dusty and hot and unpleasant, and you'd much rather be close to the mountains or close to the ocean if you're, and it's so pretty in the provinces that we thought, well, maybe an apartment in Paris is not really a good thing. And we discovered this this region through vacation. That is, we would vacation in the Pyrenees and would arrive in Paris, rent a car, and then drive down to the Pyrenees. And from Paris to the Pyrenees, it's a really long drive. So we always had to spend at least spend a night somewhere in Midway. And we wanted to get as far as we could to the Pyrenees. And this area, the Southwest, is really, it's far enough away from Paris. It's pretty close to the Pyrenees, as you could see. So it's a good place to spend the night before driving down. And that's the way we discovered that area. And we didn't want to be anywhere that was heavily overrun by tourists, as the Rhone Valley often is. And so slowly but surely sort of discovered the region, and then I actually spent some time looking for a house there. And this is the second house. My first house was in a village that's close to Lectoure, but was a little bit too small. It was a little bit too small a village for a longer stay. So that's it. I'm sure there are other reasons, but those are the most obvious ones.
We do have a question from the audience. We were wondering about cultural life in a small town in Gascony. Do you have access to musical events, museums, libraries, and so on? How do you spend your time?
There are a lot of local cultural events, and since that there are theater groups, there are concerts in the cathedral, there are concerts around around the area, often in cathedrals or churches, which lend themselves to this sort of thing. And those are usually, though, in the summer months when there is some tourism. And in terms of there's a cinema in the town itself, and there's a cinema in Condon, which is not that far. In terms of libraries, it's for me, it's been a little bit difficult because the main library that I would use would be in Paris, which is the National Library. And at the beginning, I would plan to spend some time in Paris and do my work and then come back. And now it's become more and more the case that even 16th century books that I might need to work on are available online, as long as you have a good internet, which we do. And there's high-speed internet all over town. It's not a problem to get the documents online. And that's been a real change. It's been much easier to be able to do that sort of work from really anywhere in France. And so there's no reason to be in Paris if you don't have to be. There's also a little library in every town really has what they call a médiathèque being the place where the various media are assembled, and books being one of them. So there's a small library in Lectoure itself. And there are, every town has the municipal archives for historians. That's very interesting. And so I want to look up something about the royal entries in the early 16th century in Lectoure, and I knew that they had registers of that because they had the town consistory or the town council would have minutes, and they have minutes dating back to the 16th century. And so you can get these minutes, and they're on these big rolls, and you unroll them, and then they're in hands that are very difficult to read. And so if you're an historian, it's kind of a treasure trove because you can go around to all of these towns and go into the archives for that. But it's not a big city, and you have to live with that.
Okay, any other questions? I was wondering about the roof tiles and looking at them. I'm assuming that those valleys between the two tiles are also tiled, right? That the water
Yes.
runs down through those.
Yes.
And so it's not like it's open so that water is coming down through between the tiles. Okay.
No,
From looking at the, yeah,
Yeah,
because
it's
that
sort of
would be pretty hard to maintain.
Yeah, it's a hill and valley system where you have the same tile inverted is the where the water runs down the middle. And
Okay.
and the tiles are held together through little hooks, and the hooks prevent them from sliding up and down. And then they sit on a wood structure, but also they're sort of wood panels that hold them in place. But it used to be that when in the 50s and 60s, when people were trying to cut costs and make them less prone to damage, they put sort of an asbestos-like layer underneath the tiles, but that's now prohibited. You have to work the old way. You have to work the way 16th, 17th century artisans worked to maintain the historical character of the roof. which means that the roof will last a long time once it's there, but it's a huge expense to have a roof replaced. And I was very much, I became very much aware of that when I had mine done.
And I also have one other question. And when we were looking at the sheep coming up the hillside, they were all marked, as you were saying, with, I guess, some kind of, is it paint that they use, or is it, I'm assuming it's paint that they put on the back of those sheep. I noticed there was one black one in the middle. So how do they mark those? Because you wouldn't be able to mark them with blue paint and see it. Or is it just, they don't worry about one or two black ones?
Well, that's a very good question. I really don't know. I think it's probably that there aren't that many. So if there are very few and they stick together, they stick with the others, then sort of obvious. They might also have little collars that make it make them identifiable. But the main thing about the blue the spots and the painting is that you can see them from a large distance. So on pastures way in the mountains, you can see whose sheep is where, and you can see them from the air as well. Whereas with black sheep, it probably would be more difficult. But I assume that they are identifiable in some other way. But I don't think, I mean, if the wool must be used for filling and not for not to be on the outside.
Well, but I would assume maybe it outgrows the paint, so maybe they can use, and by fall, I suppose that it would have grown out, but
Yeah.
Maybe the paint is dissipated by fall. And I also had another question about transportation between the US and France, and where do you fly into, and any kind of problems that you have flying between the two countries.
Well, the problem was with COVID. Travel was impossible for a
Yeah.
year and a half,
Yeah.
then it gradually became possible again. And for that region, which is really pretty far away from anything, the best option is to fly into Toulouse, and then Toulouse is about an hour and a half drive from the Gers. The Gers is I think it's the only department in France that has no train service. And all France is really covered with train lines and everything, and so you really need a car to move around in the Gers, which it's very rural. But Toulouse is the main airport, and there are no direct flights from the US to Toulouse, so you have to go through Amsterdam or Paris. And I've also gone through Madrid, but it's easy. Amsterdam or Paris are a little bit easier than Madrid.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. If anybody has a question, quick, get it in here. And if not, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. I found it very interesting. I've never been to France. I've been in Europe, but never in France. So I think we're gonna. My daughter was finishing up a master's degree in nursing before the pandemic, and it took her through the whole pandemic to get it done because of obstacles. And our plan was always to spend a month in Europe after she got done, and we haven't gotten that done yet. So maybe next summer we'll have a chance to go and just rent a villa in Italy somewhere and travel around Europe. So I'll have all this, and between you and Chris, I'll have a good background of information to start with. So thank you very much again for sharing your time. I want to thank the audience.
Excuse me,
attending.
Esther, there
Yeah.
is a question came in.
A question
Yes.
that just came in? Okay.
Yes.
All right. This is there some sort of political divide between urban and rural France as there is here? Are rural populations grumpy and resentful when they learn that you live in a rather liberal American city?
That's a good question. just statistically, the Gers, the department in which I live, has traditionally been socialist, and even some communists. The Communist Party is tiny now, but it was a fairly important party until fairly recently. On the other hand, you have a fairly strong representation of the Rassemblement National, of what used to be the National Front, which is the right-wing party that got the second highest score in the last presidential elections, and yes, there is a certain divide between the city and the rural areas, and one sign of this is the fact that young people tend to go to Toulouse or tend to go to Bordeaux and work, and there's a sense that the villages don't have enough young people to sustain them, and part of it is the devaluation of agricultural work, and which is I don't think a completely correct analysis of the situation, but it certainly feeds the resentment that some of the farmers have vis-a-vis the cities. In France, it's not as bad as in the United States, in the sense that well, there are several things. I think France is a much smaller country, so it's much easier to go to a city. The cities are much closer to the countryside than they are in the States. And then the main deindustrialization of France has been in the north and in the mining regions in the northeast, and then around some of the larger cities, whereas the rural regions never experience the kind of deindustrialization that a lot of the Midwest, say the western coastal states, or the west parts of the eastern coastal states, say western Pennsylvania, western New York, and so experience. So it's not exactly the same economic history. It's more a sense that that agriculture is a very precarious profession, and is a very precarious profession despite large subsidies from the European Union and subsidies from the French government as well. So that is more a problem than deindustrialization, which is, I think, more of a problem in the Midwestern and sort of the not quite East Coast, but the areas around the Great Lakes and south of the Great Lakes. So it is, yes, there is a similar kind of resentment, but it has different roots and different manifestations.
Another question, it says, is this a good place to stay for just a while if you want to improve your spoken French?
Yes, for all sorts of reasons. It's much less expensive than Paris. It's much easier to talk to people, and southern Southern French is easier to understand than French. People don't necessarily speak more slowly, but they will run, their French is less run together, so it's easier to understand for people who don't know French that well. And it's easy to connect to families or to, and you will not meet a lot of Americans, that is for sure. You will hear some British English around, but that's it. In Paris, it's pretty easy to just to get by with English most of the time, and to be around people who are Americans, because there's so many English people and so many English speaking people in Paris. So I would say, yes, this is a great area to improve one's French.
Okay, any more questions? I don't see any more now, so thank you again, Ulrich, for your presentation and your time. And I also want to thank the audience for being here.